I'll go ahead and start while we're waiting for my slides to pop up. One of the things when you get introduced, credentials behind your name are somewhat important, but in my case in mobility work, it's numbers. So 85 and 87 are my two numbers. Those are walk scores of where our office is located at and walk scores where I live. So it's important for us to walk the walk when we talk about things like mobility. I was going to also start off with some simple definitions of commonality that we can have these types of discussions on. And I've used geometry as kind of a basis for describing it. So a transit stop is a point in space. It's also a point in time if you're following a transit schedule. Actual origins and destinations that are around that transit stop, those are also points, and they're connected together with a straight line. However, in reality, there are no straight lines in our urban form, so it's usually a circuitous route. That's why instead of a circle around a transit stop, really the shape should be a polygon that's based on the actual form of what's happening in those neighborhoods themselves. So, but taking this idea of a polygon then is what I'm calling a catchment area or a transit shed. Now, a lot of people will talk about the districts themselves, and that's where you see these quarter-mile radiuses around a lot of stops. Those are the areas where you really want to concentrate density in. You want to concentrate both origins and destinations. But what I'm talking about is actually the transit shed or the broader area, and I'm trying to get people to think outside the circle, outside of that radius that's typically used. All right, so in terms of the elements that are really important to mobility as it relates to transit-oriented districts, travel options. What does the transit user have as options when they're either getting to or leaving from the station itself? And it's very important to have those options available to support a car-free or car-light lifestyle. And then secondly, the access enhancements. This is what a lot of us think about in terms of active transportation, connections, making it more walkable to a transit stop or making it more bikeable. But it's, in addition to that, it also supports all those other land uses and operations and the day-to-day internal trips that could occur within that area. So it's not just about connections to transit. And then finally, a grouping of things that can be put together, mobility management policies or TDM. You're not often hearing those terms as much with transit systems as I'd like to see them, but I consider TDM to be a broad arching element that just looks at trying to lower the overall trips that are generated, the miles that are traveled, and that is also very important around transit districts as well. So under the travel options themselves, used to be in the past, you get off a bus and it's like you're thrown out the door. It's like, hey, you're on your own now. And some of our transit stops still exist in some very remote areas without really much in the way of facilities. But now we're trying to look at multiple mobility options, a lot of different ways of getting around that can extend a transit shed area really out to 3 to 4 miles when you look at an overall catchment basin. But we do have to remember, though, once a person in some of these options is actually in a vehicle, once they get in a vehicle, sometimes it's hard to get them back out. So a lot of these are meant to be little short connector trips. But you can't count on some of these too much because once, as I mentioned, once they're in that vehicle, they're going to continue to their destination in a lot of cases. So one of the concepts that's becoming more popular now is this idea of mobility hub. It's not just a transit district. It's not just a circle on the ground. It's looking at a variety of land uses around a site that you could connect together with a variety of different transportation options themselves. And so Toronto and the Metrolinks has been very at the forefront of a lot of these mobility hub research elements. And out of the 9 primary factors that they say is important for supporting this type of transit, 4 of them are about mobility, or they call seamless mobility. So it's the ability to pull all these different things together. Part of it is about a safe and efficient movement of people at the transit station, a well-designed transit station itself for the good high-quality user experience, and strategic parking requirements as it affects the transit user as well as the rest of the land uses around there. That same diagram on the right is from Toronto and Metrolink. So they typically are looking at different zones. So you have basically a primary, secondary, and tertiary zone, then a catchment area, and this can go out to, in their estimation, about 3.7 miles. SANDAG is starting to look at this. Here locally, the diagram on the left where you actually have hub zones of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is typical what's starting to happen in this research. But when we get right down to it, most people taking transit are relying on walking either to or from those destinations. So, 79%, 87% typical of once people get off transit, then they're going to walk to their destination. So that's a major component of it. And that average time is about 16 to 20 minutes in terms of walking time of these stations that were actually analyzed. So even though we talk about a 5-minute walk or 10-minute walk, the reality are that people are walking actually a lot further that are currently using those systems. And then the distance itself from the station to the origin or destination is a big predictor on how people will adopt using transit in a certain area. But you can see even on this diagram, it's a little bit scattered. You certainly want to get your density and real physical changes in land use close to the station, but you can still look at capturing people a little bit further distance away. And it's not just a quantitative element, it's a qualitative element. When you really look at what's that walking environment like, and it makes a big difference how far someone will walk. If it's a very highly attractive environment, including weather protected, not like we really need it here in San Diego, but in a lot of cases, places really do need that weather protection. People will walk up to 20 minutes, which is basically a mile. But if it's a very unattractive environment, there's a lot of concern over potential crime, or the person doesn't feel comfortable. They're going to feel like that even the 2-minute walk is too much through certain areas. So there are things that we can do as planners and urban designers that influence areas around transit stations that would entice people to walk further than they currently do. So part of that is about parking supply and cost. Now parking is also important, we're not just trying to make it difficult for everyone else that's in the area to find parking, so therefore they take transit. What we have to look at is parking supply actually is one of the biggest factors of stretching out our areas, making it the scale of our areas much more vehicular-based instead of walking-based. And so excessive parking actually stretches out those areas, and they run up the cost of affordable housing and other projects that might be marginally feasible in those areas. We have to look at universal access principles, which go above and beyond just the minimum ADA requirements. And then there's this idea of safety, the concern that a person actually has. And it can be perceived or it can be real. Perceived dangerous conditions affect behavior. People will not travel through an area if they feel uncomfortable in those senses or they feel unsafe. And then there's the same thing that applies to pedestrian safety. There's a lot of large roads that we're all having to be next to traffic, and the statistics are not really great for pedestrians relative to the danger that they put themselves in those vehicular environments. So we have to look at, heavy traffic, wide streets to cross. Is there any pedestrian priority signals? What's the adjacent traffic speed? All those things really do affect a person's decision to walk through an area. And then, especially in San Diego, we have a number of barriers. They could be man-made barriers like freeways and rail lines, but we have a lot of canyons and hills that really do affect the overall walkability. And then, one of those factors when you really start looking at the perfect place to have a TOD is when they have a walk score and a transit score up at the 100 range. But it's hard to find an area that has a super high walk score without transit being part of that number, and then vice versa. You're not going to get a good transit score in an area unless you have a good walk score as well. So the two go hand in hand. But in general, City of San Diego is listed as 49 overall average. So it's listed as a car-dependent environment. Bikes themselves actually can extend that range of transit by quite a bit. There's a little bit more speed differential between certain cyclists, but in general, a 15-minute commitment of time, even a slow cyclist can get up to 3 miles away from that transit stop itself. So part of this is about thinking outside the circle. Every time you see a circle, and I do have to be a little bit cautious here because most all of our other panelists had circles on their maps, but to me, that's a first indicator that it's not being looked at accurately in terms of the transit shed itself. So on the graphic on the left, in an area where it has a very gridded system, you can actually go further than what those radiuses are. You can actually capture a larger area simply because of the grid system. But if you look at the one on the right where there's different topographic barriers and street configurations, you don't even get out close to where the typical circles are, whether it's a quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile. But when you look at the speed differences between pedestrians, they're actually pretty tight. Even the difference between a fast pedestrian and a slow pedestrian isn't that dramatic. So from a range of 4 miles an hour down to 2.4 miles an hour, if we take into account the things that slow a person up in a roadway system, crossing streets, waiting at traffic signals, or hills, then we've dropped those averages down a little bit. But in general, if you have 20 minutes available, the average walker can walk a mile. And even with a five-minute availability of time, you can walk about a quarter mile. So I have kind of a little of a case study here. This is actually the proposed Tecolote transit station as part of the Mid-Coast extension. And these are all based on existing conditions. And in the upper corner, you see kind of a summary of acreages, and we see a population balance of the people that fall within those zones. So if you take the typical 5, 10, and 15-minute walk time around the station, we're really talking about a pretty limited number of folks that are within that particular zone, around about 1,200. And then if you actually make improvements to the walkway system, we actually extended it by about another 400 people just by adding a few missing segments of walkways. So that can be pretty substantial. When you really get to a overall possibility of looking at a shuttle system, especially when you see UCSD up in the USD up in the right-hand or middle corner of that, you can actually get to it through a shuttle system. And then a car share program, if you assume just a few minutes walking to find the car share and then a 10-minute drive, this is the distance you can get out to. And bikes, because you typically would have your bike with you, or a bike share program would be right at the transit station, is actually the ones that you can get the furthest away from those stations themselves. So we compare that with the other typical zones that normally would overlay that you see all the time, these circles. You can see it doesn't really relate well to the transit shed because it's lopsided. There's a lot of geography and barriers to the west here that wouldn't pick those up. So in this particular case, up to 8,400 people would fall within those zones themselves. But if we look at the basic zone that a lot of people only count, the quarter mile, we're really only down, in this case, 46 people that fall within that walkable zone. So we're really underestimating the number of people that you could attract to an area. So in this case, if you take all the zones and you have this really assumed percent capture that really drops dramatically when you get between each of these points, we can come up with 1,100 people that are possible transit users within that same zone. So when it really comes down to, if you just take that quarter mile circle under current planning, you might only pick up 46 people, but if you take the mobility hub approach, you could be talking about 1,100 people that would potentially ride transit in that particular spot. So mobility management, I tend to put a lot of things into a category and call them TDM. In my opinion, they're things that are necessary to lower typical trips. They're things to lower vehicle miles traveled. They're things to lower overall congestion levels, especially single drive alone. So a TDM program happens to be the target, in my opinion, of a lot of different trends that are out there from an economic, environmental, and social standpoint. So there's a variety of demographic and changing conditions that are being laid at our feet as planners and politicians that are really important. So I think we are underestimating how to capture these trends. I think there are really great things being placed at our feet. So if you take the millennials and the baby boomers as the demographics and the generational priorities saying, I don't really want to drive, and they're actually saying, well, I'd prefer reclaiming some of my time while I'm taking transit. And so at that point, they don't mind a little bit longer trips on transit. They want to minimize their costs. The Fitbit generation, they want to get their steps in. So they want to even get off a transit stop early just to walk a little bit further. And they also are out there saying, let me be part of the solution, especially as it relates to climate change. So given that, those are some really good trends that we should be able to capture. And some of the tools that we can actually bring into place that help bend that trend towards that target that we're all hoping for is car share and bike share operations that could occur in an area. Information technology, everyone's capturing all types of information on how to get to a place, how you track and find different options for you for mobility options. Even the way that we're motivated by things like a walk score, or like what's really referred to as gamification, is ways of getting people really interested that appeal to different parts of our generation. And they like to use the on-demand services, which can be all part of the same overall mobility hub solutions. Providing them with guaranteed ride homes whenever they happen to run a little bit longer and lose their connectivity to carpool, vanpool, or transit schedules. And then, as I mentioned before, parking and how you unbundle all those things is very critical as well. And then there's some tax and financial incentives. So if we do all these things right, we can actually take those trends in a very positive method and look at how mobility options can really turn a lot more people to using transit and having not only a transit supportive district, but also having transit supportive people. And I think they're out there, they're lining up for this type of stuff. We just have to best know how to capture them. So with that, I'll have Jim go over a couple of case studies. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jim Lightbody. I'm currently working with AECOM, but previously was the planning manager for the Transit District, VTA in Santa Clara County, where we are and have been working on TOD planning for a long time also as our light rail system has been built out. So a lot of common experiences, and glad to share those with you. I've got a couple of examples. Still. Oh, there we go. Okay. I wanted to just mention, I think, as Mike has described, and I think as related to the other policies of land use and other development policies, the key for successful mobility strategies really is where you have a number of mutually reinforcing components, whether it's bike sharing, walkability, last mile strategies, demand management strategies, where you can combine as many of those together, you're going to have the most effect. And I've got a few examples, a few case studies to share with you from the Bay Area. The city of Mountain View, probably best known these days as the home to Google, has been working with the companies there, the high-tech companies, to develop a plan that would allow continued employment growth while retaining the kind of a small urban community character of the city. And that led to a recently adopted precise plan that will allow another 15 or even more thousand workers added in the North Bayshore portion of the county around the Google complex and others, but really restrict the amount of drive-alone vehicle growth that would occur in conjunction with that by turning the area into much more of a walkable and bikeable community, by emphasizing strategies that emphasize alternate modes, transit, biking, and walking, and in particular setting a very ambitious goal for drive-alone commuters at 45%, which sounds pretty challenging, but it has helped a lot by the fact that Google today brings about 35% of their employees on commuter buses from San Francisco and throughout the Bay Area. So they've got a good start at it, but it's a good aggressive plan. This is kind of the lay of the land there. It's a classic last mile type of situation with the companies, Google and Intuit and LinkedIn all have their headquarters in the North Bayshore areas, it's called. It's about 2 miles from the downtown portion of Mountain View, which is where the Caltrain commuter rail station and light rail stations are. So a big part of the plan was to develop this last mile strategy, which included a number of things. First of all, they've established a Transportation Management Association, TMA, that will be currently running some shuttle services, and will be greatly expanding that as the companies continue to grow. The plan also includes development of a 3-mile cycle track, protected bike lanes that connect between the downtown station and the freeway, across 101 freeway into the North Bayshore area. It includes a half-mile reversible transit lane in the most congested part of the corridor. And all of this is funded by a combination of development fees and some tax increment and other funding. So probably maybe a little bit of external grant funding, but for the most part, this is able to be funded through the development plans that the city has. And there you can see a couple of the pictures. This plan has been approved and is just moving into the implementation stage right now. There are also a number of other similar last mile strategies throughout the Bay Area that have been developed over a number of years, providing publicly available shuttles, but operated by private entities, generally with private funding from connecting to BART and Caltrain stations. That's part of the whole network of transit. And there's just a couple of examples here. Emeryville connecting to the BART station in the East Bay, funded through a business improvement district. San Mateo County connecting a number of services connecting to the Caltrain service, and Stanford University, which has a large system and a very aggressive TDM program connecting to the Caltrain station in Palo Alto. All of these carry several thousand riders a day and have been very successful and kind of a model for how the development particularly in Silicon Valley, where many of the jobs are located, as in Mountain View, a mile or two from the main transit lines. Another example in the Bay Area is the Contra Costa Center Transit Village, located around the Pleasant Hill BART station in the East Bay, which is a very successful combination of TDM programs and other services, shuttles, and the like. So this is kind of another example of the model that has been developed at many of the stations, and primarily private sector. In some cases there's public involvement, but many of these are strictly a private sector program that's developed. Also wanted to mention another aspect of mobility plans is that as you're successful and the transit system grows, you may need to expand or improve the transit facilities to add capacity, to improve access, bicycle parking facilities, a number of things, shuttle stops and so forth. So many of these transit stations will evolve over time, and the development of the facilities, the transit facilities themselves, may give you an opportunity to do some development planning also. One of the best examples on a larger scale is the Denver Union Station project, and I think we'll hear more about that later in the program. But it's a very ambitious effort, which is still underway, but a lot of the transit infrastructure has been built with a new commuter rail station, new light rail station, underground bus concourse, all of which serves to kind of provide a catalyst for the development that surrounded this. And they were able to do this in part because it was an abandoned or rail yards that were able to be converted, and a combination of improvements there to development. And there's some very interesting financing aspects that we may hear about later on that. Finally, I just wanted to talk briefly. I've got one slide about bus rapid transit, because there has been, and frequently there's concern about whether a BRT project would have the same ability to provide act as a catalyst for development. And it's true there's been perhaps fewer examples and less research and opportunities to kind of test that theory, but there are some successful examples, and there's been some research that's been conducted. One of these I mentioned here is a developer survey from a few years ago that tried to isolate the factors that would influence developers in terms of where they would locate projects. And in terms of BRT, the key really came down to the degree of permanence. Unlike a rail station, bus rapid transit can have a whole range of facilities, and where they found where developers agreed there was a common opportunity was when the permanence of those facilities, whether it's the station or a dedicated bus lanes or something that would establish that as an area that could be used as a catalyst for development. So that I think is encouraging in terms of BRT project, but we need to obviously see more examples around the country too. With that, I think is your slide. Okay, GB's got one more example he's going to talk about.
This one takes some of the TOD and some of the mobility hub that Mike was talking about. So this is Overlake. This is suburban Seattle. This is right next to the Microsoft World Headquarters. The next station is where the mobility hub is, which is jointly funded by Microsoft to a large tune of money. So the context here is suburban. Light rail opens in 2023. The goal was to create an urban place in the suburbs that would be appealing to Microsoft to be able to attract young urban professionals that had to go to work in the suburbs but wanted to live in an urban place. And so there's a series of strategies here, things like stormwater, green streets, dense residential, retail, and then office in this. And the quick sequence was to do the plan, then an implementation framework, then for the city to acquire a number of these sites, then to do infrastructure, so there's common stormwater here, green streets, and then demonstration projects and to move forward. And this has attracted some interesting interest. The Clinton Climate Change Initiative has selected this as a project to work on implementation because they just frankly like all of those pieces and how those come together. So that's it.
Yeah, we'll have questions. Let me just add one thing, though, about this, the connections. As many of you here locally know, that we have an issue with our tech sector up in Sereno, Mesa area, where they're concerned that the constraints on ability of people, their workers, to get to the employment centers is creating a serious productivity problem for them. And they've had their own workshops about that. And trying to manage that situation, being in a freeway off-ramp environment to a business park. I think what's interesting in seeing some of these examples, whether it's Redmond and Microsoft's also been expanding into Bellevue, Washington, which is being served, Boston, which we've heard of before, Silicon Valley, and also in San Francisco, where the tech sector's now migrating into San Francisco. And we're working with Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, 100,000 people town in an agricultural community. It has one of the world-class medical centers in the world, trying to become more urban. And part of the reason of trying to create that mixture is because they feel it's important to compete for the global talent for their industries. And especially the millennials that are coming through and into the workforce and will be the leaders of the workforce over the next several decades and the entrepreneurs. So in order to attract that talent, they're saying that workforce is looking for something different. And even places like Research Triangle in North Carolina, one of the great technology parks in the country, is now trying to build a town center within it in order to attract that talent so that they stay competitive. Columbia, Maryland, was talking to a person here who used to be a developer who now works with Howard Hughes, who now is implementing a downtown plan for Columbia, Maryland, one of the quintessential new towns of the 1960s, 1970s. But of the new towns of that era, it was built in a suburban environment along freeways. They're having a hard time attracting the industry to locate there for their town center project because they're not along the metro line. They're not along the transit line. And so what they're trying to do is figure out a way to create basically a downtown in a suburban new town in order to compete and make that link somehow to the regional transit system in the DC, Baltimore metro area. So a lot of good examples of why connections are important, not just for use of the transit, but also for economic development.